Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry, we're getting started a little bit late. My name is Nicole Haldupis, and I'm the marketing coordinator at Breakwater Books. We're very excited to welcome you to the launch of Land of Many Shores, Perspectives from a Diverse Newfoundland and Labrador. Tonight, editor Ainsley Hawthorn will be joined by contributors to the collection, Paul David Power, Delores V. Mullings, Ivan J. White, and Gemma Hickey for readings, discussion, and an audience Q&A. Please feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A box throughout the event or on the comments on Facebook, and we can ask the authors during the Q&A period. We'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging the land on which we operate as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit and Innu as the original people of Labrador. I have a short greeting from our Breakwater president and publisher, Rebecca Rose, which she wanted me to share with you. So Rebecca says, I want to congratulate Ainsley and all of the contributors on the publication of Land of Many Shores. I know for many contributors, this represents the first time having their work published, and I hope it's been a rewarding experience for them so far, and I hope it won't be the last. We're delighted to have already received follow-up submissions from some contributors, and we encourage any other contributors that intend on pursuing further writing to submit to Breakwater for consideration. My team and I are so proud of this book. Collectively, it represents many of the priorities of Breakwater's mandate. We've long been committed to books on social justice issues and to raising the profile of underrepresented voices in our province. And we're continuously trying to improve upon our approach to doing so by actively engaging more editors, copy editors, authenticity reviewers, and designers from BIPOC, Indigenous, LGBTQ+, disability, and marginalized communities. We're pleased with the advancements we've contributed to book publishing in the province on these fronts, but recognize there's always more work to be done and are committed to doing it. I'm grateful that Ainsley recognized these efforts in Breakwater's publishing program and brought the proposal for Land of Many Shores to my attention. I remember clearly when I first received and read her pitch back in May 2019 and marched straight to my editor asking they follow up with her immediately to say, we're publishing this book. Bringing this project from Ainsley's vision of a more accurate representation of who we are as a province to the beautiful book being launched here tonight has been a privilege. We hope she and all contributors are pleased and look forward to getting this important book into the hands of readers within our schools, libraries, government institutions, and all communities throughout the province and beyond. Congratulations again to all, and here's to a great launch tonight. Thank you for that note, Rebecca. So if you're wondering where you can buy this beautiful book, you can purchase your copies in person at our shop at One Stamps Lane if you're in St. John's, from our website, www.breakwaterbooks.com, or from your favorite local bookstore. I'll put that link in the chat for you. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce the editor of this collection, Ainsley Hawthorn. Ainsley Hawthorn, she, her, is a cultural historian, author, and multidisciplinary artist raised in Stony Brook, Newfoundland and Labrador, and now based in St. John's. Since completing her doctorate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Yale University, she has lectured on her research at universities in Germany, Austria, Italy, Canada, and the United States, and has been quoted in El Mundo in Spain, Apartment Therapy in the US, the Toronto Star in Canada, Activa magazine in Portugal, and the News Lens in Taiwan, among others. Passionate about using her academic knowledge to bring new ideas about culture, history, and religion to general audiences, she co-hosts the radio series Apocalypse Then for CBC. Blogs for Psychology Today, and has contributed to a variety of other publications, including the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and the Newfoundland Quarterly. She is currently completing her first solo authored nonfiction book, The Other Five Senses. Please welcome Ainsley.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm delighted to be here tonight celebrating the launch of this book with just a few of the many wonderful authors that are part of it. In addition to being able to buy the book at Breakwater's website, in a bookstore near you, or getting it through one of the province's libraries, public libraries, I also wanted to mention that I'm giving away with Breakwater 2 copies of the book, one on my Facebook page, Ainsley Hawthorn PhD, and one on Instagram at Ainsley Hawthorn. So if after the launch you don't have a copy of the book yet and you want to pop over there and enter to win a giveaway copy and a few other little extra items, I'd be delighted for you to do that. And I'm looking forward to sending a free copy to someone. It's been a real pleasure to work on this. So the inspiration for this book comes from a frustration that I have and have had for many years with the way that we talk about this province. Because we always talk about diversity as though it's something that comes to Newfoundland and Labrador, but is not of Newfoundland and Labrador, that it's an import. So you see headlines like New Wave of Immigrants Brings Diversity to Rural Newfoundland and Labrador, or Newly Multicultural St. John's Examining Human Rights Practices. And it's always pitched as something new. I think that's a myth. That's a failure to recognize all of the diversity that has been here for centuries, for millennia, from this region's various Indigenous peoples who have lived alongside each other for thousands of years, the Mi'kmaq, the Beothuk, the Innu, and the Inuit. And in addition to that, settler cultures other than the Irish and English, who are the 2 we typically think of, we have the French, the Chinese, the Jewish community, the Lebanese community, who've also been here for hundreds of years, remain here today, in addition to more recent immigrants from all over the place. And when I started thinking about putting a book together with some of those voices that we just don't hear as frequently, I wanted to open it up to other types of underrepresented stories about this place as well. So things like people with disabilities, with mental illnesses or addictions, people from the 2S LGBTQ plus community, people who practice religions other than Christianity, and other experiences that we just don't talk about here, but that are really essential to the fabric of our communities. So I reached out to 24 wonderful people with different life experiences, and each of them wrote a nonfiction piece about their own story, the story of their family, or the story of their community. And it was such a pleasure to edit this book, because giving people free rein like that, you are surprised and delighted by what comes back to you. So what came together was a book that's diverse, not only in terms of people's identities and life experiences, but also their writing styles and the way they tackle the subject matter and the way they think. So it's been really rewarding to put such an interesting and varied read together for people. And I'm really excited to share the work of 4 wonderful authors in the collection with you this evening. So first, I'd like to introduce Paul David Power, who has spent the past 20 years working as a writer, actor, director, and communications professional in various media and for diverse organizations, including dramatic script for the stage. His formal training includes holding a BA in English with a concentration in theater and a BAA in journalism. He has a long history in raising awareness and understanding about disability issues through his work as a playwright, columnist, director, and actor. Most recently, his newly published play, Crippled, was named a finalist for the 2021 Governor General's Literary Award for Drama, which is a fantastic accomplishment. Paul is going to be giving us a reading from his chapter in the book, Who Says You Can't Go Home?
Thanks, Ainsley. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Yeah, I would like to share with I've been told I have 5 minutes, so I decided I would start off my chapter in the book. And I'm going to leave you guys then on a particular point. It's a cliffhanger, and you'll have to buy the book to find out the end. But I really appreciate the opportunity to share my piece and to be part of such an awesome project with so many talented writers. So here we go. My piece is called You Can Go Home. Home. There's something about that word, especially for Newfoundlanders. Whether we've lived in another part of the world for a year or 20, for most, the word home immediately conjures the image of the rock. Maybe it's the unique landscape of rolling hills, craggy cliffs, dense forests, juxtaposed by miles of barren bogs. Maybe it's the distinct salty ear and rhythmic sound of the crashing, foaming waves of the cold Atlantic that surrounds our island. Or perhaps it's the people. Whether it's family or a distant acquaintance you run into on the street, they always feel like familiar friends, ready to invite you into their kitchen for a cup of tea. No need to impress here. Whatever the reason, more often than not, when you encounter someone living away, the first thing they usually say is how much they would love to move home. There's a lifelong connection. But can you really go home again? As a Newfoundlander, I appreciate my life here. After a university education at Memorial University and then a short stint in Toronto to get a journalism degree, I settled into a life here in Newfoundland, here at home, working in communications with the provincial government, a government job, the pot of gold at the end of a rainbow for the Newfoundlander. I was with that job for 8 years, writing speeches, news releases, advertisements, designing graphics, and excelling with promotions, awards, accolades, and true security. I was set. And then the unthinkable. I left Newfoundland. About a year before I met the love of my life, Jonathan, it had started out as a pretty casual thing. But as time went by, we evolved from casual dating to couplehood, calling ourselves partners. Now you have to understand that this was a pretty big deal for me. It's my very first long-term, openly gay relationship. There was something about Jonathan that gave my life a piece that was missing, fulfillment in a good relationship, both emotionally and physically. I was born with a physical disability, a combination of genetic and developmental defects in the womb, for lack of a better word, they caused my legs not to develop as they should. My legs are shorter than the rest of my body. The bones are somewhat fused rather than easily able to bend at the joints. The muscles around those bones are weak. As I aged, it became apparent that for me to walk, it would require the use of full-length leg braces and crutches for support. It's a physicality I have lived with all my life. And with my physicality came awkward stares, inappropriate questions from strangers about my medical circumstance. And in the gay world, for most, I was viewed as someone who could be a friend, but let's not go too far. Physical intimacy with the guy on crutches was not the top fantasy for most guys you encounter down at the local gay bar. Jonathan was different. He made me feel attractive both inside and out. I felt lucky to be with a man who was not only physically attractive, but also had a great heart. It just added to the perfectness of the time of being here at home. And then Jonathan received a promotion and transfer from work all the way to Calgary, Alberta, an opportunity away from home. He wanted me to go with him. He wanted me to leave home. The decision was mine, and it was a difficult one. But as the saying goes, I did it for love. What a life change. We did well in Calgary, but to me, it wasn't totally home. Life was different. 3-hour traffic jams, a work lifestyle that saw you leave at 6 a.m. and arrive home at 8 p.m. And casual visits with family or friends was impossible with an astronomically expensive flight lasting 8 hours each way to Newfoundland. Sure, I missed home, but as time went by, home started becoming wherever Jonathan was. If anything, it strengthened our relationship and reliance on each other as a couple. 2 Newfoundlanders making it on their own out west, far away from home. We were there for 5 years. Eventually, another work transfer would find us in Moncton, New Brunswick, and life got even more settled and domesticated. We bought a house. We both had jobs we liked. We spent our nights like an old married couple, making dinner and binge watching sci-fi. Weekends were filled with the usual errands, taking pride in our home improvement, handiwork, and gardening, loving the home we were creating. Life was good. And because of the proximity, more frequent visits were possible from family and friends from Newfoundland. It was the best of both worlds. And then on September 24th, 2013, at 6:30 p.m., I walked into the bathroom of our home and found Jonathan. He had died suddenly, an aortic dissection. I called an ambulance, went to the hospital, was told they could not revive him. I was sent home. The chicken I had cooked for dinner was still sitting on the stove when I got there. It all took less than 2 hours. The days and weeks following were like a blur, like living outside my body. This could not be happening. How could everything change so quickly? Jonathan, where are you? I don't remember who was around. I don't remember how I slept, or if I slept. I don't even remember who made what arrangements. When faced with such a shock, the mind really does shut down. We held Jonathan's memorial where else but home, Newfoundland. I stayed back in Newfoundland after the memorial for a few weeks, but eventually I had to return home to our house in Moncton, to my job, to a life that no longer really existed. I still remember walking into our house for the first time since losing Jonathan. It was eerily quiet, still, cold, and dark. This wasn't our home anymore. And as much as I tried to pretend, it never felt like our home again. I left the house that had transformed from a happy home to a cold mausoleum and moved into my own apartment in Moncton. In fact, after Jonathan passed, I tried 5 different apartments, but none felt right. No matter how many times I tried to make the space like our house, no matter how many times I set up furniture and knickknacks the way Jonathan would like them, no matter how many of Jonathan's sweaters and shirts I kept hanging in the closet, and no matter what location I decided to live, it never felt like home. After about a year, I thought I had finally come up with a solution of homelessness: go back to Newfoundland. I had received a job offer to return to the provincial government. I decided I would go back to my life before Jonathan, back to the same province, the same job, the same neighborhood, all before I met Jonathan. I would go home. But sometimes what we plan in our heads doesn't always turn out as we planned. And that's my cliffhanger. You'll have to buy the book to find out what happened.
That is a great place to end it, Paul. Ending right before you sort of find out how it all works out for you. And as readers will discover, Paul's piece is the last in the book. And I did that for a couple of different reasons. One is because it's such an emotional piece and goes through this range of different emotions. So it's such a strong experience to read, but also because it's exploring the idea of what home is, where you find it, what makes it, and in some ways is equivocal about the idea of tying your home to a place like a province like Newfoundland and Labrador. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I thought that was so thematic to what the whole book is about. So it's a wonderful meditation to end on. Thank you so much, Paul, for reading us a piece of it this evening.
Oh, thank you.
And now I'd love to introduce our next reader, Dolores V. Mullings. PhD is the Vice President for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. She's a member of a large extended family, caregiver for her mother, and the mother of 2 living children. She's a human rights and anti-racist consultant and trainer, as well as a public speaker. Her scholarly interests fall under the umbrella of anti-Black racism and critical race theory, and explore decolonizing post-secondary education, mothering, parenting, mental health and wellness, 2S LGBTQ+ concerns, immigrants, settlement and integration, and human rights policies. So as you can see, her expertise touches on so many of the themes that we delve into individually in this book. And Dolores will be reading to us tonight from her chapter, Black Motherhood and Womanhood, Resistance and Resilience. Thank you so much for being here, Dolores.
Thank you, Ainsley. I'm really happy. I'm very excited to be here and to read from my chapter. And without further ado, I am just going to start. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to read from the section about Black motherhood. So it starts, when my daughter, let me just set my time as a, when My daughter and I arrived in St. John's, Newfoundland in August 2009. I was in the middle of a forbidden love affair with, wait, hold on for a moment. I will come back with the juice later. First, let me do something that I love to do, and that is to share my experience of being a Black mother and an anti-Black racism and anti-racist academic activist living on the Rock. My young daughter and I left a large extended family, well-established Black communities, and friends in pursuit of a new life filled with adventures, knowledge, and lessons in St. John's. We landed on the Rock in the middle of August on what should have been a bright, sunny day. Nature, however, had indeed greeted us with a foreshadowing of what the weather and the general human connections would be like for the next 9 years, frigid. Some days it seems as if I have lived in the province for 50 years, and other times it seems like I've only arrived yesterday. The most challenging part of my life in St. John's has been my role as a Black mother, trying to guide a young Black woman to understand her place in society. I live in the skin of a Black woman, a warrior mama, who asks questions that challenge the stereotype of Black children. Hanging out on the Rock, the nicest place on earth, failed to bring relief from the idea that my Black child was inferior. So I had to fight even harder to remind her of her greatness. Living in Newfoundland as a Black woman, parenting a Black youth coming of age was daunting. As women and mothers, we are socialized to believe that we must be everything to our children. We are expected to show perfection in parenting our children, to support, love, nurture, guide them in order to create miniature adults that reflect success based on the prescribed notion of what success looks like. All our children are unique and need different types of parenting and resources to help them reach their full potential. In addition to these, Black parents must adopt alternative strategies for Black children to support their growth as they move into adulthood. Regardless of how hard we work, the strategies we employ, and how much we advocate with and for our children, we sometimes feel like failures as mothers. During our first year in Newfoundland and Labrador, I came face to face with that ugly feeling of being an ineffective parent. My heart broke for my daughter as I could only watch and listen while what Philomena S. calls everyday racism and what we know is actually anti-Black racism affected her. Most of her friends were wonderful, ambitious, and friendly young people, keen to participate in the usual coming of age activities in most young people's lives, with the unique twist of growing up on the Rock. In spite of my daughter's flourishing social life, impressive extracurricular activity, involvement, and seemingly successful adjustment to our new home, she failed to thrive. Black children need to see themselves positively reflected in their surroundings, books, education, teachers, and in the media. Although she was born in Canada and is fluent in both French and English, Canada's official languages, she was presumed to not only be an immigrant, but one that was not proficient in English, the dominant language spoken in St. John's. Her Blackness motivated students at Holy Heart Secondary School to refer to her as the ESL kid. This derogatory and discriminatory term is used primarily primarily to describe racialized immigrant students in at Holy Heart. The characterization robs racialized students of their humanity and excludes them from the fabric of Newfoundland society. It also stripped my daughter of her Canadian identity at a time when she was already struggling to find a place to call her own in Newfoundland. These subtle types of anti-Black racism made her move and settle much more challenging, despite her having class, language, and health privilege, as well as a vibrant social life and close friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that reading, Dolores. And that is just a taste of all of the content and stories that you tell in your chapter. I have had so many people say to me since the book has come out that this chapter was really eye-opening for them. And I think when we talk about myths that we believe about Newfoundland and Labrador, one of the myths that white Newfoundlanders and Labradorians want to believe about the province is that we're not racist. We tell stories like the Lanier Phillips story, which was told in Oil and Water, and other sources about a Black sailor who was shipwrecked here and didn't experience racism and the ways that that later informed his own activism. We tell that story because we want to believe we're not racist. And the result is that we don't talk about and don't pay attention to the way that anti-Black racism does underlie and inform our behavior here. And I think that your chapter is so important for people to read and so revealing. So I hope that many of you will have the opportunity to take a look at it and to follow Dolores's other work. She's doing so much in this area that is so important and so interesting. So thank you, Dolores. And our next reader is going to be Ivan J. White. Hailing from the Mi'kmaq community of Flat Bay, Ivan J. White is an emissary for his culture, heritage, and people. Artistically, he has worked as a writer, musician, and filmmaker in both amateur and professional capacities. Formally educated in the field of marketing and practiced in the areas of media and communications, he has been exploring the intersections of business, arts, and Mi'kmaq identities since his teenage years. These themes come out of a desire to better understand his place in his community and his role as a Mi'kmaq. And Ivan is going to be reading to us from his chapter in 3 parts. Thanks, Ivan.
Good evening, everyone. I want to start off by saying I'm incredibly honored to be here tonight and also incredibly honored to be in this, which I hope is the right way. I don't know if I flipped my camera correctly or not, but I'm going to read from in 3 parts, and I'm going to read part 2. 1, because it's short, and I don't want my voice to be the dominant voice in your head when you're reading it. And 2, because I think it helps clarify basically how I wrote this. I wrote this driving back and forth to work in Corner Brook. I talked to my phone because I was getting highway hypnosis way too often, and I was afraid that I was going to have a car accident. So I shut off the music and I spoke these words into my phone, and later Ainsley let that happen in book form. And so here's part 2, Family as Community Interlude. Our children, my children, will grow up knowing who they are as I did, and my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents before them did. We were the Indians, when very few beyond the boundaries of our community would admit that they too shared in our identity. I am absolutely humbled to now have the privilege of being able to say I grew up knowing who I was in Flat Bay and Shillop Cove, 2 beautiful Mi'kmaq communities, full to the brim with examples of Indigenous activists, leaders, thinkers, and warriors. To clarify for you, knowing who I was did not mean wearing feathers or stooping in teepees or chanting at the rising sun. I have worn feathers in my adulthood. I've built and slept in teepees in my adulthood. I've also sung from my heart as the sun rose to caress my face. I was not meant for these things, however. They have never come to me easily, and I struggle heavily to be involved in a way that is meaningful for others as well as myself. But starting in my teenage years, as I debated and conversed with elders in the community, I felt the tug. My family and community had a different path for me, you see. I'm a child of loving and wonderful parents. I wish everyone could say the same. I was given everything they could offer. My upbringing was rich and vibrant, and I wanted for nothing that I can remember besides the written word. I love to read anything that I can get my hands on and head around. I read a lot then, and I still do now. I chewed through encyclopedias when I ran out of books and comics. So this want wasn't related to our financial standing or class. I was just a black hole that swallowed words instead of light. I still cannot recall if I realized we were a specific class, as I wasn't raised with the same idea of rich and poor as most others. Some people had more things or a larger home, but I never felt either of these things created a hierarchy within the community. Instead, there was a true feeling of community built around fairness and generosity. I struggled to find a better word to describe it than sharing. I was free and I was cared for. That was the point. I was free to take my bicycle and ride the 4.5 kilometers to Big Pond. It was within the boundaries of my community and a place where my parents knew others would watch over me and care for my well-being. Although the community is isolated through access with only one road in and out, it was also isolated through the will of others, publicly called a filthy place full of degenerates by outsiders. I've never experienced that. Flat Bay is special. It is the heart of Mi'kmaq people on the West Coast. Its people are strong-willed and full of heart. There are very few times when I can say I experienced any meetings with someone who was completely unknown to me. We know our people and will defend them to a fault. We will also call you out if we falsely claim the community. We know our people. I said I was going to be short, Ainsley.
Thank you so much for the wonderful, short but sweet. So thank you so much for the wonderful reading, Ivan. And I'm glad you described the way that this was written, which was dictating it while you were driving and your thoughts. I think of this chapter, when I talk about the different styles that people wrote in for the different chapters, I think of this chapter almost as a manifesto. And what I mean by that is that you so boldly state your values, the importance of the Mi'kmaq nation and culture in this place, the problems with the way that the government is sort of like stepping in and running things, the problems with the way things are being run politically, and also a vision for the future. So at the end of your piece, you're kind of sort of imagining a possible future, which I think is so interesting. It's such a wonderful journey from beginning to end, and you touch on so many different ideas. So thank you so much for your reading and for your wonderful contribution to the book.
Alan.
And for our next reader, I'm delighted to introduce Gemma Hickey, who is a multi-award-winning international author and celebrated human rights activist from Newfoundland and Labrador. They've made headlines worldwide as an advocate for the 2S LGBTQ+ community and for survivors of religious institutional abuse. Their highly acclaimed memoir, Almost Feral, which was also published by Breakwater Books in 2019, chronicles their 908-kilometer walk across the island of Newfoundland and the uncharted emotional terrain traveled within. It is a fantastic book. I've read it and highly recommend it. So I'm delighted to welcome Gemma to read from their chapter, House.
Thank you so much, Ainsley, and thank you, everyone. What a great lineup, and I'm so proud to be among the group of readers tonight and also to be a part of this collection. I'm going to read from my piece, House. Basically, house is a metaphor for the body that we live in. And so I draw on my grandparents and their experience with their first house, which wasn't so great, and how they turned it into a home, similar to my experience with my own body. So the chapter is longer. I'm going to pick segments from the chapter to read it. So hope you enjoy it, and thank you again. Why does your voice sound so patchy? Asked my aunt. Her soft voice heavy with concern. Do you have a cold? Not at all, I replied. I just started testosterone, so my voice is cracking like a teenage boy. What's that, Paula? Gemma wants to be a boy. My 96-year-old grandmother bawled out. I'd stopped in to visit my grandmother before hiking the trail on Signal Hill. Her house, where she raised her large Irish Catholic family, was based in the historic Battery, overlooking the St. John's Harbor. Cradled in the arms of the surrounding hills, the community mirrored a rural outport in the heart of the capital city. Pocket-sized houses and fishing stages draped in colorful hues were strung along the hill's base. From a distance, they resembled the decorative trinkets on a charm bracelet, like the hopes so many islanders hung on our fishery. The slopes enclosing the harbor were full of trails, first beaten by foot soldiers during both world wars as they scurried between forts like ants on a hill. She's on testosterone, Mom, my aunt responded in an awkward tone. My heart sank when my aunt referred to me as she. I wasn't prepared for the emotional response it invoked in me, nor was I ready to engage in a larger discussion on pronouns. I felt the anxiety swell like a wave from deep within, anticipating a negative response from my grandmother. I braced myself between the arms of the flower pattern Queen Anne-inspired chair nestled in the corner of her living room. She was sitting in a rocking chair, and though her eyes peered at me over the top of her bifocals, the knitting needles in her hands choreographed the dancing wool in her lap without missing a beat. I told your mother you were a boy, she proudly stated, and that put me in her bad books then. But you're a bad boy, she added. Gets away with it too on account of the devilish grin and handsome face you got on you. Apparently, a few years prior, my mother went to my grandmother in tears after she took me to a movie at the Avalon Mall. An elderly man in a wheelchair, accompanied by his daughter, was having a difficult time getting the push button to work on the automatic door at the main entrance, so I rushed over and held the door open for them. The woman told my mother that I was a real gentleman. That's my daughter, my mother shouted in response. It wasn't the first time someone mistook me for a boy, and my mother, whose beauty reflects every notion of conventional femininity, had had her fill. I was a tomboy when I was little, and after my high school graduation, I got a buzz cut and came out as a butch lesbian. The clothing I chose to wear was masculine, which I liked, but for some reason, the skin I was in never seemed to fit right. I didn't know what that meant at the time. What will you do with your breasts? My grandmother asked. I'm going to get them removed, Nan, I responded. Proper thing, she said with a wink. Sure you won't miss them? You got your pick of breasts with them girls you're with? Will you grow a bird, I wonder, she asked. No, but my girl will get a bit bigger, I answered. Well, that's all right for you then, she said with a chuckle. If I had that, maybe I'd like having sex with your grandfather. We all laughed. Nan, what if I don't want to be a boy or a girl, I asked. Just be Gemma, she answered. That's all Nan wants. There are so many layers to trauma. Years of therapy helped me to peel some of them away. But when I began to pay attention to my body, many more became apparent. I had recently completed a month-long walk across Newfoundland to raise funds and awareness for Pathways, an organization I founded for survivors who, like me, were abused by members of the clergy. Before the walk, I put myself through a rigorous training schedule in order to be successful at my goal of walking across the island. I lost 75 pounds, but all that weight loss heightened my dysphoria. My breasts became more noticeable. I tried binding them, but no matter how hard I tried to smother them, they were still there. They felt like lumps on my chest. Scar tissue from the wounds of my sexual assaults. Reminders of why I was raped. Because I was a woman. Was I betraying my own kind for wanting them gone? Especially when so many of my female friends had lost theirs to breast cancer? Suddenly, the cultural weight of breasts was becoming too heavy to lift. Just be Gemma, of course. Why didn't I think of that? I don't need to be trapped within the binary of male or female. I could just be me. For 38 years of my life, I was socialized as a woman. I was abused as a woman. And though I never really felt like a woman, which is the main reason why I never wanted to dress like one, I didn't want to erase parts of myself that could inform the person I was becoming. I decided to keep my name and give up my breasts. I made an appointment with the private clinic in Mississauga, Ontario for top surgery. My grandmother had a bad fall a month before my mother and I were booked to fly to Ontario. She couldn't wait to get out of the hospital and go back to her home, which she loved so dearly. My family took turns looking in on her, including my cousin Anne-Marie, who was a nurse. When it came time for her medication, my cousin warned my grandmother that the pill she was about to take was unusually large, and therefore may be difficult to swallow. My grandmother, who never minced words, offered some wise ones in response. Anne-Marie, the biggest pill I ever had to swallow was acceptance. And once I did, everything in my life got better. A week or so later, my grandmother had another fall. She began to hemorrhage in the middle of the night and had to be rushed to hospital. I caught a cold, so wasn't able to visit her, but I spoke to her every day by phone. I just picked up my car from the garage when my mother called me, her voice quivering, telling me to hurry into the hospital. By the time I got there, my grandmother had died. I wept over her body, still warm. Nan would have wanted you to get your surgery, said my cousin Kelly. You have to go. When the tears ceased, I asked my Uncle John to lead us in a prayer. I knew that's what my grandmother would have wanted. We held hands and prayed the Hail Mary to honor her, as her first name was Mary. My family moved the wake and funeral ahead so that my mother and I could take part. We were scheduled to leave a few days after she had passed. At the funeral home, during the wake, my mother and aunts motioned for me to come up to the coffin. My Aunt Paula took my grandmother's prayer card, which she used to pray with every day, from her cold hands, kissed it, then passed it to her sister to kiss, and then on to my mother. After my mother kissed the card, she crossed it over my breasts while the three of them prayed the Our Father. Of all the prayers to pray over my breasts, before I had them removed, the Our Father. Seriously, like WTF. But whatever. In that moment, given where we were, I made a game time decision not to challenge the patriarchy. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for that reading, Gemma, and for those particular selections from your chapter. Reading your chapter, I both laughed and cried when I first got it. That story about your grandmother, what a role model and someone we should all strive to be like. Just be Gemma, that's all Nan wants. What a statement of love. It was such a beautiful thing to read and powerful. And thank you for sharing it in this beautiful piece. And as readers will see, this is one of the first pieces in the book. It bookends Paul's at the end of it, because both of them are these reflections on home and how we make our place in this world. And I think that's something that we're all sort of considering through these reflections in the book in different ways, is how do we fit in, how do our families fit in, how do our communities fit into this place that we share in the world. So now I'd like to open it up to a discussion. And I'd like to invite everyone who's with us here on the Zoom or on Facebook Live. If you have questions for our four readers or for me, you can pop them in the chat here on Zoom. You can raise your hand and ask it verbally. We'll invite you to turn off your microphone. If you're on Facebook Live, you can pop your question in there in the comments. We have Nicole Haldupas from Breakwater, who is keeping an eye on that and will let us know. So we'll be able to answer questions from wherever you're watching this, and we'd be happy to do it. But I'd like to start off with a question. Because we're talking about different perspectives on this place, I wanted to ask each of you, if you had to describe your Newfoundland and Labrador, so Newfoundland and Labrador as you see it, what would you say? And I'd like to start by throwing that to Paul. I'll let everyone know that Paul is booked for 2 events this evening, so he will be leaving early, and that's why I'm going to ask him to answer first. So Paul, what do you think?
I guess I get that. I'm leaving early, so I don't on the spot. No, it's a great question. Thank you. God, the words of Newfoundland and Labrador. It goes back to my piece. I mean, the main word that always comes up is home. And I think it's, I'm very lucky. I talk about my disability a lot. I talk about losing my partner a lot. All that, but it's made me who I am. But my definition of home is where you feel safe, right? Where you feel wanted and loved, and that feeling of safety. And I've been fortunate enough to travel a lot, and nothing ever feels as safe and warm inside, not outside, warm as home. And I think that's because of how I was raised and where I was lucky enough to be raised and by who. And especially life experiences after the past few years. You know, it's a luck of the draw where you're born, what family you're born into, if a family, all that. So I think for me, it comes to mind of home and appreciation for Newfoundland and Labrador.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that answer. And next, I'd like to ask Dolores for your reflections on that. How would you describe your Newfoundland and Labrador?
You know, for me, it feels like that rock with different texture and, you know, different opportunities. So in some sense, I feel my experience has been hard. My daughter's experience was hard, but I also think there were parts that were malleable and where this rock is opportunistic. So to me, there are elements of hope as well. You know, so it's not just one thing for me, but a range of possibilities.
I think you captured that beautifully in your writing too, the way you sort of look at, you know, the rock as a metaphor, and what that represents for your experience in the province is really beautiful. And Ivan, I'll ask you next. So what is your Newfoundland and Labrador?
My Newfoundland and Labrador is that part, that second part that I just read, emanating out across the entire province. It's that feeling that I get when I'm here in my house in St. George's, or I'm home with mom and dad in Flat Bay, or my extended family in Flat Bay. Is that sharing, and everyone has your back, and you cannot fail. You feel like you cannot fail. Everyone can fail and will fail at points, but if you feel you won't, I fully believe that you're less likely to fail. And I think my ideal Newfoundland is to take that second chapter and to let it basically emanate out across the entire province, to share and collaborate and include, and have people accept who they are at whatever stage they are on their journey, especially specific to indigeneity here in the province, to be in Mi'kmaq here in the province. It's okay that you just found out. You don't have to insert history behind it to build yourself up. No one is coming after you for this, right? The government of Canada set up a flawed process, and we're dealing with it. Yeah,
and I really would love people to read your chapter and get your reflections on that, because it's so complicated that there are long-standing close-knit communities here, and kind of the complicated intersection of that with the government process that's happening is really, it's unique across the country, really, because of our strange political situation. Yeah. And so Gemma, and I'll ask you, what's your Newfoundland and Labrador?
You know, I've been thinking about the concept of home for a while now, considering what I've undergone in my own body, and what that means. But also, I think home isn't just a place, it's also a feeling. And I think that for me growing up, you know, everyone was welcome in my home. It didn't matter who met you, as we say, you know, where you come from doesn't matter. You were always welcome at the house, and you always had a seat at the table, and that's the way it was, and that's how it should be. And that's the Newfoundland and Labrador that I want us to be, that I know we are. We're getting there. You know, we still got work to do, but that to me is what it means to be home. And, you know, like a lot of us, I write from a sense of place, and I struggle with the idea of identity, not just gender or sexuality, but also the factors that influenced how I identify from where I come from. And it's a constant struggle, a constant state of arrival, but, you know, we're all getting there.
You know, you raised something, and I think everyone touched on this in some way in their answers, what we want Newfoundland and Labrador to be. You know, I asked, what is it to you? And I think everyone also said what they want it to be. And when we talk about busting the myths about what our province is or isn't, and part of that, I think, is acknowledging that we have problems like racism, just like everywhere else that we need to fix. We have discrimination, we need to work on these things. We also, I think, have a dream of what Newfoundland and Labrador could be as an inclusive, diverse, accepting place that I think we all really want to work towards, and it's something we can build by recognizing that we're not there yet and then working towards it. Now, we do have some questions, so I'm going to read them out. The first one is from Kimberly Ryan, who says, Ainsley, this is a great collection of stories by many talented writers. Thank you to everyone. Do you foresee a second book with stories from different writers about diversity in the province? Kimberly, I would love to do a second book like this. I had such a wonderful time doing this. I would love to do another collection. And there's so many interesting thinkers and artists and activists and writers and so many people who have interesting ideas to share, more than enough for another book. So I think we'll see how this one goes. And if people like this one, it is something I would absolutely be delighted to do. We also have a question from Facebook, and this is for Paul, if you're still available to answer questions. The question is, Paul, are you more at home writing prose or while being a playwright, or are they the same? Great question.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that question.
The beginning was, are you more at home writing prose or being a playwright, or do you feel they're about the same?
I'm probably more at home. Oh gosh, that's a good question. They're so different to me as a writer. Definitely you get to convey a lot more in prose with description and feelings, whereas with playwriting, you have to be, your characters have to be believable in what they're doing or saying or their actions to convey the feelings you want to convey. So I love dialogue because it's such a quick payoff. You don't have to worry about description and everything. You just speak it, right? And so I love that dialogue. But prose is much more therapeutic for me, I think, a more gentle approach to writing for me. While with writing plays, I'm acting out the characters in my brain, and usually there's conflict and everything. So it's a lot more raw emotion. Prose is a nice flowing river, I feel like.
And I suppose with theater, the other thing is that ultimately it's a collaboration, because you sort of do your script, but the finished product, so many different people kind of contribute to the finished product.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, very different experience. So Paul, you're probably heading out now. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciated it. Thank you for your reading. It was a pleasure to have you here. And because we started a bit late, I think I'll just wrap up the panel with one last question. Bye, Paul. Thank you. And he's heading over to an event that Quadrangle is live streaming. I think it's going to be on their Facebook page. That's Quadrangle NL, if anyone wants to go check that out after this one. And I also wanted to just ask from everyone on the topic of misconceptions and myth busting. I was just wondering, what is one misconception you'd like to change about this province, about Newfoundland and Labrador? And I'd like to start with Dolores.
I think the misconception I would like to change is that everybody is nice. Just because it's not realistic. Everybody is not one thing anywhere else, you know? So why do we need to squeeze ourselves in this impossible space? It's impossible to live up to something like that. It's, you know, it's really a setup for failure. And so we just need to get rid of it. People are genuine and they're nice. And, you know, sometimes things are challenging, and there are all kinds of things in between. They're not just nice. They're not one-dimensional, you know, caricatures. They're wholesome beings. And so I think that's where I would say, like, we really need to bust one of those myths, because it's too limiting for a people, peoples that are so great in so many ways.
That is a great, great answer, because you're right. Talk about limiting. it's wonderful to be nice, but yes, no one can be nice 100% of the time. And that's a very sort of limiting way to think of your culture, as that's the one dimension that it represents. That's a great answer. And Gemma, I'll ask you next. What's one misconception you want to bust about the province?
I was just going to say about everyone being nice. I mean, we all don't have the same experiences here. You know, I think everyone should try to be nice, but that's impossible to to sustain. You know, or it's just such a sweeping generalization. You know, and so it's different for everyone. But I think also that you know, one of the misconceptions that just popped into my mind would be that we're all a good time group, you know, that we like to party and like to drink and have a good time and that kind of thing, you know, and you know, I think we certainly like to have a good time and we certainly know how to throw one, you know, but that doesn't encompass us as a culture. You know, there's other aspects about us that are quite extraordinary and stand out outside of that kind of you know, narrative about having a good time and that kind of stuff. So I think that's just, you know, another generalization that I hear whenever I go away, that, oh, you're such a good group of people and you knows how to throw a party, you know, but there's more to us than that for sure.
Well, that's another good one. And actually, TJ Smith, another of the contributors in the book, he writes about how damaging that idea can be in his chapter, in the sense that this idea that, you know, you're supposed to be a big drinker and a big partier can lead to some really like problematic behavior. It can lead to addictions and it can lead to mental health issues. So, I mean, apart from the fact that it's just not correct, it's also potentially harmful, and we should be thoughtful about how we use ideas like that. And so last, I'll ask Ivan, so what's one misconception you'd like to challenge?
If anybody on the call knows me, my go-to answer for this is we were here. We were here time immemorial. And we weren't complicit in the genocide of another Indigenous people. So when you want to talk about friendliness, how about acceptance? Every time that we have literally proved with settler writings that we were here, the goalpost gets moved to say, well, that doesn't sound permanent enough. That doesn't sound, well, if we weren't here, why did you ask us to show you around? Why did you say, well, we need gold or we need ore, and then ask a Mi'kmaq person to literally show you where it was? Indigenous people, Mi'kmaq people don't inherently know how to go from place to place and know where things are just because they exist on the land. Our connection to the land isn't one made up by Hollywood that expresses, that say, okay, if you're get an Indigenous person and you put them in the woods and they can find themselves a way out automatically. No, people get lost. People get lost. But if we weren't here, why would you have asked us to show you around?
And that is such an important myth to change. We've, you know, settlers love the Beothuk people, because if there were no Indigenous, you know, if all the Indigenous people died, then settlers could just say, oh, this was empty space that Europeans moved into, and have no obligation to anyone else. But we know
even that concept of land ownership is not the same from my perspective. I don't own land. I keep land and take care of it for other people, right? I don't understand why it's so important to erase the people who accept the erased people and not the ones that are still here.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that we'll have a greater appreciation of this region's indigeneity. So many people have been here for thousands of years. We have the third largest Indigenous population of any province in Canada. That's amazing. We don't acknowledge that about this place. And so I'm hoping that's something that'll start to change, that now it's being discussed more. And we do have a Facebook question, an open question for anyone. What would you want to say to Newfoundlanders living somewhere in between acceptance and harm of diverse communities? Is there anything you'd want those people particularly to hear from you? And I'm thinking what is meant is maybe people who don't, people who are white, cisgender, straight, and maybe don't interact very frequently with other types of individuals. People are able-bodied, maybe don't have much experience. And is there anything in particular you'd want them to hear from you? And maybe I'll start with Gemma this time.
I didn't get the last part of the question, Ainsley. What was it again?
The question is, what would you want to say to Newfoundlanders living somewhere in between acceptance and harm of diverse communities? Is there anything you'd want those people particularly to hear from you?
Wow, that's such a broad question. And it's difficult to know how to answer that. I guess speaking from my own experiences, particularly now from having transitioned from someone who's been assigned female at birth to someone who's taking up masculine space, I feel like people don't really see my vulnerability anymore because I look more masculine. And so, just like anything, before people make assumptions based on how people look, get to know us, get to know us. Sometimes we have to unlearn just as much as we've had to learn, or, I think there's a process of unlearning here, in particular with what we've been taught and the systems we've been raised in, and how it's also influenced by coloniality. But I think that, is one of the things that I think now that I feel very misunderstood by people around me, in particular because I take up masculine space. So, so get to know someone, and just leave those assumptions at the door.
Well, thanks, Gemma. Thanks for sharing that. That's a really important point. And Ivan, I'm going to ask you, so what would you say to someone in that space?
I would say what my father's always told me is that ignorance is always an opportunity to educate. And Gemma just said it. No knowledge. You can always be educated. You can always learn more. And the way the question was framed, I know they didn't mean it like this, but why would someone fall into harm? It's like it's a choice between two things, and I don't think there is a choice in knowing and understanding and being kind and empathetic and sympathetic and compassionate to other people. I don't think that's a choice. I think that's how the world should work.
It's an obligation, I think. In a best case scenario, it should be an ideal, an obligation. Yeah. Thank you, Ivan. And Dolores, what would you say?
I'm with the other panelist. I'm not quite sure of the question, but I want to follow up on what both of them said as well, and just add to those pieces in terms of, I think we all know what hurts us. We have a good sense of what hurts us. If something is wrong at school with our children, our grandchildren, our nan, our papi, if they're hurting, we're hurting too. So I'm taking it back to a little bit of personal responsibility to do some learning and do some understanding outside of our own immediate circles. I also think, though, there's an institutional responsibility for people in leadership positions to facilitate the changes that we want to see in this province, so that the onus is not on people who are historically and systemically marginalized to carry the weight and the burden of helping us to understand what not to do or what to do. Because the danger for that, when we go to the personal, is that we actually don't look at the bigger issue, which is really systemic. What are the policies in schools, or how do things operate, in the library? I'm just speaking at places, right? I think those are some of the bigger pieces that the four of us here on this panel really can't answer in a way that's going to shift the agenda, but those people, you know, in leadership positions, politicians, you know, those of us in the university settings, hospitals, you know, wherever they are, that they're making policies and they're drawing up programs that they need to be supporting us. And I think the other piece too is that we actually need to have all the, so everybody in this book, we have different perspectives. We need all of those perspectives in those places of power so that we can influence the changes that we need. The more of us that's in this book that are in spaces that like those, you know, places of, you know, bastions of power, the better I think our province will be. We see that across the world when we have different people at the table, right?
That is so important. The points you make about leadership and about having change in systems. So if people have heard the term systemic racism or systemic discrimination and they aren't sure what it means is the system, the policies of government, the policies of your education, the policies of your workplace create a discriminatory environment or create a discriminatory culture that everyone participates in, but it's more than the individual. So it's not something that individuals can fix. It has to be fixed together collectively at an organizational level. And that is so important. And I would say, you know, when everyone touched on at the individual level for developing empathy, get to know us, get to know people with diverse life experiences. And if you don't have people around you from outside sort of your circle, read books, read a book like this one, listen to a podcast, whatever's accessible to you, watch a YouTube video of someone with a different life experience as a way to sort of understand how their experience of the world is different from yours. And it just opens your eyes to so much. And we do have another question in the chat. Gemma brought up an interesting thought about identifying as being someone from the province. If asked, how would you describe what it is to be a Newfoundlander or Labradorian? Maybe we'll start with Ivan on this one.
So I have to apologize for lack of presence from Labrador currently on the panel, but not in the book.
Yes, we have Labradorians in the book, but yes, there is a lack of Labrador on our panel tonight.
So how would I describe what it is to be in? Well, okay, let's talk about window dressing, because we have a ceremony that literally accepts everyone into being a Newfoundlander, but it's a very full of rock with terrible stereotypes and no one understands half of it when they do it. But we have this ceremony that called a screech-in that literally allows someone to become a Newfoundlander. But do we ever follow up? What is that? What is the point of that? So it's, for me, what it is to be a Newfoundlander Labradorian is how you set yourself. It's how I set myself. I'm a Newfoundlander. I have people in my family who are literally Newfoundlanders who were born before this province became a province. How did they define it? Let's all like reflect on that. Reflect on the fact that we have something that's window dressing as a part of our identity. To say, like, here's something that you can use for tourism, and you can make people Newfoundlanders. So if asked, how would I describe what it is to be a Newfoundlander? I think it's highly specific to the person, and that kind of stuff, the acceptance of other people, I wish it was deeper.
And I'm so glad you brought up screech-ins because I went to a Trixie Mattel show here and they screeched her in at the end of the show. And she said, wait a second, this is one of these BS things that you make people from outside this place do that no one ever here actually does themselves. She had her number like that, like, no one ever does that here. It's only something we make visitors do. So I'll ask Dolores next. So Dolores, what do you think it means to be a Newfoundlander or Labradorian?
I think for me, it's tricky as well. I am still new-ish, 12 years, still feel new in some sense. What I feel though is until we acknowledge the full history of the province, it's difficult to honestly and uniquely talk about a Newfoundland and Labrador culture. And that means the historical cultures of the Indigenous peoples, but also, you know, the people that are coming, and everybody in between. But it feels to me as if being connected to this land that we're borrowing also means protecting it and caring for it so that other people that are coming after us can benefit from it. You know, and I think that just means that's a big responsibility that I'm not sure that I see it in a wholesome, in a full way. You know, when you look at what's happening in different parts of the province and, you know, who's disadvantaged by some of the decisions. And I think some of those decisions, again, that's coming from, you know, leaders actually creates the situation where it makes it tricky for us to, well, again, speaking as somebody who's coming out from outside of the province, you know, newly, it makes it tricky for people to feel a sense of connection in a way that contributes meaningfully without having to fight to hold space.
Yeah, I think it's really telling that you say you've been here for 12 years and you still are sort of not sure. You still feel new. And I think that feeling of like, well, how long does it take until I'm a Newfoundlander or a Labradorian? You know, what is the bar? And especially for people who are racialized, you know, it's so much they're because we haven't incorporated as a place our diversity into our sense of self, makes it so much more difficult for people to feel that sense of belonging and of being part of the community. And Gemma, the question really was inspired by you. So what would you say it means to be a Newfoundlander or Labradorian?
You know, one word comes to mind when I think about us, every one of us, resilience. You know, we all have that in us. But I've been interrogating what definitions mean. And I think, as Ivan said, you know, it's an individual experience, really. And it means nothing. It means everything. It could mean none of those things. It's, you know, I'm not constrained by labels or categories anymore myself. You know, now that I've kind of freed my mind and I've come out as non-binary and that's how I identify. And I feel like, you know, the definition of what it means to be a Newfoundlander and a Labradorian is as broad as the people that live here. It doesn't have to be defined as one way or the other. You know, it just is, and it's constantly evolving and constantly changing. And I think that's how we all are, really, and that reflects us as individuals and as a group. So that I'm not sure if that really answers the question or not, but I think we have to live that answer ourselves. And it means to what it means for each of us, you know, is an individual experience, but something that really can't be defined right now, especially in the last couple of minutes of our talk. But anyway,
I think that's a great answer. There is no static definition.
Yeah.
It's changing and evolving. And I will say that what this question brings to mind for me and for everyone watching, I'd say, pay attention to who is described as a Newfoundlander or Labradorian, because I'll tell you something I see a lot in the way that people speak and in media coverage is who isn't called a Newfoundlander. So you'll see like Muslims in Newfoundland instead of Muslim Newfoundlanders. Right. And it's a little difference, but it's an important one because there's a sense in which you're saying that this group of people are forever outsiders, that you can't be here long enough. I mean, we've had a Muslim community here for a century more very long time. We have a mosque here in St. John's, well established for many decades. I went there when I was in elementary school on visits. How long does it take for someone to be a Newfoundlander? So just pay attention to that. I think if we made our language more inclusive, that would be a good place to start. And I think we'll clue up the conversation here. We went a little longer because we started a little bit later. So thank you so much to everyone watching and for celebrating the launch of the book with us. Really appreciate everyone joining in. And again, the book is available through Breakwater Books, their website and their store in St. John's. It's available anywhere that local books are sold at bookstores near you. It's available in libraries across the province. And I'm giving away 2 copies on my social media. So you can go to my Facebook, Ainsley Hawthorn PhD, or my Instagram at Ainsley Hawthorn to enter the giveaways. And I'm excited to send a couple of copies to people. I'd also like to thank the funders who supported the book, the Canada Council for the Arts and the City of St. John's. Both gave grants that allowed us to pay all the authors at a professional rate, which is so important and so tough to do given the economics of publishing. So thank you to everyone who pays taxes in Canada for allowing us to do that. It's a wonderful thing that our country does. And I'm going to pass it back over to Nicole to give a goodbye from Breakwater. Thank you so much for our readers and panelists. You're phenomenal. And it's been such a joy and honor to work with you and everyone else in the book. So thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Ainsley. That was amazing. I'm blown away by all of your incredibly thoughtful readings and discussions. My goodness. Thank you so much to Ainsley, and thank you to the readers and panelists, Paul, Dolores, Ivan, and Gemma. We'd also like to take, this book is so beautiful. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Canada Book Fund through the Department of Canadian Heritage, and the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. We'd also like to thank the copy editor of the book, Lisa Furnett, and the interior layout designer, John Vanderwood. Don't forget to check out this incredible collection at your favorite bookstore. And there's a link to that in the chat and in the Facebook comments as well. Thank you so much again for coming. Have a good night.